So we're here at Kilcoral, a 15th century church with some very interesting stories with it. It's said to be built by Cameron of Lochiel after the devil himself, in the guise of a cat, gave him the impetus to do so. There's traces of religious site here since 600 AD, and it is dedicated to St Cyril, who is presumed either founded the church or re-established the church in that time. It is the main burial ground of the MacDonalds of Keppoch, which we will see as we further investigate the graveyard.
Julie's just noticed another abandoned village just across the glen. We need to look that one up when we go home as well. Somewhere else to visit.
The church is mentioned in a papal supplication in 1466. It must have lay abandoned for a while. It was roofless in the 1920s when the relatives of Nova Scotian immigrants helped fund the chapel to get its roof again. There are masses held once a month up here. In pop culture also, it is used in the filming of 𝕮𝖈𝖔𝖙𝖆𝖓𝖃, like so many things in this area.
This church itself is just out past Roybridge, which is just past 𝕮𝖈𝖔, which is just north of Fort William. It's really cold.
There's a story told by John MacDonald, who lives in Highbridge, about one of the 15th century clan chiefs of the Camerons. He was a freebooter and he liked to acquire other people's bits and pieces. Bit of a thief and a vagabond.
I can't feel my fingers.
He was known as Alan of the Forays because of the badness he was up to, but he did eventually feel guilt for this, and it is also said that he built this church here and another 6 to actually gain penance for the 7 massive forays that he had committed in the past, and in order that he could go to heaven feeling not without sin, but at least he had atoned some of his sin. There is someone buried just inside the door of this church, which is why we wanted the key. Someone of some infamy, though it could be his infamy was he just had 2 stories. Let's see. His name is Ewan Mackintosh, and he was known as Red Mackintosh of Culloden. 3 months before Culloden, he suffered a shoulder injury where he was shot with a musket ball in the Battle of Falkirk. The musket ball had gone so deeply into his shoulder that it could not be removed. So apparently he is buried still with his musket ball in his shoulder. At Culloden, he broke both his legs. He was carried on horseback the whole way here to the village of Bohanton, which is about 1.5 miles north of here. So quite a distance from Culloden he had to travel. There is another story that has been handed down through the generations about Ewan the Red of Culloden. The story says he died at Culloden. His men carried him the whole way here to the chapel. He was buried inside the door due to talk at the time that the Hanoverians on their way back through Culloden would be ransacking graveyards and causing disrespect with the dead. There's a story of a rather interesting haunting in this graveyard.
You're talking about ghosts again, aren't you?
Yep. About 300-400 years ago, a man was buried in the graveyard, and that evening there was an unholy noise coming from up at the top of the graveyard. It started at dusk and kept going well into the night. After a couple of nights, the priest came up to investigate, and after 5-10 minutes came back out of the graveyard to his curate and asked him for the Bible. On his way back up to the graveyard, he also stopped by the burn, filled his shoe with water blessed it to make it holy water and headed back up into the graveyard. Eventually the noise died down and the priest arrived back out of the graveyard rather dishevelled looking, saying that there had been a little internal dispute in the graveyard and they weren't overly happy about the new guy that had been buried, but it was all sorted now.
This is another one of those graveyards where there are lots of old headstones, but there are also a lot of even older headstones buried below the grass. This church has been here for an awful long time. In fact, this is interesting. There's a very old cross carved in this one. There's an interesting one here. This is a memorial for the chiefs of Clanranald of Lochaber.
This is the memorial stone to Ian Lorne, also known as John MacDonald. He was also known as Bear John. He was a bard, i.e. a poet, and a politician. This is the largest stone in the graveyard and it's erected to his memory. His stone sits at a very peculiar angle to the other stones, as all the other stones are facing due east. And his stone faces towards Choirill, which apparently he loved greatly.
When I was reading about this place before, there were a whole bunch of unmarked graves near the entrance, which is this part here. And there's got to be about a dozen or so mounds and no headstones. I need to look up the story about that. I'm sure there was something about this. I just don't remember now. I'll ask Julie. Julie,
What?
over there, there's not this church, behind the church, there's a bunch of mounds with unmarked graves. Do you know what they are?
Yeah.
Are you going to tell us?
When I get round to them, yes. I'm on this side of the graveyard currently.
Said she'd know.
Yeah, these are the old priests of the chapel buried here. I'm not really sure why they have unmarked graves, but it has been discussed that that's them.
Julie's just spotted another one with a very old cross on it.
Well, I would imagine judging by I was reading bits and pieces on the graveyard, and these are probably the older chiefs of Keppoch buried here.
Ah, right. Aye, because there's a newer one at the top, there was a metal plaque, but cool.
Yeah, I'd say this would be
That would make sense next to the church as well.
Yeah. He was one of the quite important chiefs in Keppoch.
Yeah.
Ronald MacDonald 𝕮𝖎𝖔𝖎𝖐.
Ronald McDonald. I'm wondering if that's part of the McDonnells of Glengarry.
Right, we're missing two people. One we expected to miss. The first one was Alexander, who fought with the 45s. We won't find his headstone here or even a marker, as he was burnt in a hut in Culloden after the battle. I'm currently facing east. The light upon the mountain is beautiful. But Alexander's son Ranald is buried somewhere here. It said he wasn't buried on the consecrated ground because after the death of his father, he basically decided to forsake the faith of his fathers. So he was buried on non-consecrated ground. Is it consecrated ground now and he's part of the cemetery? Is it non-consecrated ground and we have to spend 2 hours climbing around that hill that is awash with bogland and many deer? Now
off to try and find Cameron of Keppoch, who apparently is buried outside the consecrated ground from the graveyard. Apparently the head of the east end of the graveyard, which is over there. Surely they could have built this flat. Right. That's the west end of the graveyard. That's the east end of the graveyard. Where's the head of the graveyard? The head of the east end. Does that mean at the top or at the far end? I have no idea what I'm looking for here. It's someone who's buried outside the graveyard. No, what I thought was the gravestone outside of the graveyard. It's actually an upturned wheelbarrow. Looking at this side of the graveyard, it's all much newer headstones, and I'm just wondering if the article we read referred to the original boundaries, and it may have been extended, in which case at the head of the east end would mean the top of the hill, which means I need to walk back up that hill. It's a really steep graveyard. I still can't feel my fingers. I'm losing feeling in my lips.
I'm sure people wonder why everywhere Martin and I go, we're at graveyards, we're at churches. But I think it's important to see our history through a graveyard. This is where everyone ended up. This is where the stories are. This shows a lot of the social structure in an area. The headstones will tell us how many people had a wee bit more money than others as well. The McGill-of-Antich family were obviously quite a power family in this area as well, judging their proximity to the little church.
Stopped off the way back down the hill from the church, because we saw these last time we were here and we have no idea what they're for. With a look round them, we couldn't see anything. So if you've got any ideas, let us know. There's no plaque or information board or anything, it's just a couple of cairns with crosses on top. There's also the remains of two over there and another complete one over at the far end as well. And we have absolutely no idea. I'm assuming it's a memorial to somebody, or...
I bet you would have information in the chapel that was locked.
Probably.
There is another story coming down the hill of a bit of a riot that ensued coming down the hill after a funeral. Guy had been buried up at the cemetery, obviously, and they might have had a few drinks too many. Well, it was a Catholic wake, so they'd probably been waking them for about a week. They're all heading down the hill, and one of the younger chaps starts lifting up clods of turf and firing them down the hill, and he keeps on hitting this wee old man. So one of the Cameron clan, they say to the young chap, here, you know, wise up, knock it in the head, and he doesn't. So the guy from Clan Cameron gives him a square go.
Right.
That, because everyone has been imbibing too much, turns into a wee bit of a scuffle. Must have been a decent enough size scuffle, because at least 4 of the Clan Cameron lost their bonnets in the process.
Well, that's...
Yes.
Yeah.
So they all headed home and clearly woke up the next morning with rather ringing heads and wives wanting to know where their bonnets were. So one of the Camerons, he drew the short straw and was sent back up the hill towards the chapel to gather up the bonnets. But as he was walking through the village, of Roybridge, people were hiding in the house because they were a wee bit worried that you might start at them again. But he came up to the chapel, he gathered up the bonnets, and he headed himself back home with 7 bonnets, despite the fact he only lost 4, and no one actually challenged him over that, strangely enough. So there you go.
Ghosts. Ghosts.